Grief, anger and a demand for change. The death of Kumanjayi Little Baby prompts calls for answers and urgent action to confront systemic failures in remote Indigenous communities. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. This week, the government will sign off on what we're told will be its most difficult and ambitious budget to date. Changes to property, tax breaks and trusts on the way. The Treasurer and the Prime Minister are both flagging bold reform, all as inflation pushes higher. This morning, Nationals leader Matt Canavan ahead of both the budget and the Farrer by-election. But Canberra's attention hasn't been on the nation's finances alone. The interim report of the Royal Commission into the Bondi terrorist attack was released on Thursday. And then came the heartbreaking news of a young Indigenous girl found dead outside Alice Springs. Shock and sadness quickly turned to anger and demands for governments to do more. And a warning for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers. This piece includes an image of the girl used with the permission of her family.
Heartbreak and rage in the country's red centre.
The man suspected of killing a 5-year-old girl was bashed before being arrested by police.
Raging crowds pelted rocks at police.
Demanding police hand the accused over.
They were chanting, "Bring him out." They wanted to enact their own justice.
It is the site of carnage, a place where people have gone crazy.
All week, the community of Alice Springs come together searching for a little lady, a little baby that was taken by a monster. And that hard work was undone.
We appreciate and understand that people are very angry and grieving. There is never an excuse or an acceptability of violence as a response.
Police have moved the alleged killer to Darwin.
Police had to protect a man in custody.
There's a system set up here, and the Western rules will deal with that person.
We want to see the community come together, but we certainly understand people's anger.
We do need to come together as not only a community but as a nation.
We need to let the family mourn, not create more sadness and angst in our minds.
We're trying to just call calm.
People aren't prepared to have honest conversations about the state of affairs in our town camps.
Right now, the focus needs to be on supporting the family.
Why doesn't this government do more? And, you know, why hadn't they previously heeded the calls for Royal Commission into the sexual abuse of Indigenous children?
There's going to be a time and a place for conversations down the track, but it's not today.
Who was working with this family or these families? Where's the systemic failures in this tragedy?
It would be remiss of me as an aunt to the little one to ignore the plight of those living in town camps.
There needs to be an inquiry into the systems that failed this baby.
I've seen a lot of the violence firsthand. Things need to change.
We have a community in absolute trauma, in grief, and we have to get through this first, and that's really my priority today.
Well, we're joined this week by Paul Sakkal, Chief Political Correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, SBS Chief Political Correspondent Anna Henderson, and Daniel James, co-host of the 7am podcast. Great to have you with us on the couch, Daniel. Let me start with you. We saw a furious reaction in Alice Springs the other night. You've been talking to locals there. What's the sentiment like now?
The sentiment now is that there is just tremendous sadness around the place. Now that the alleged perpetrator has been found and moved out of the town, things have calmed down a little bit. But the tremendous amount of sadness around the loss of a little girl that should have been able to live her full life and thrive within her own community and her own culture is something that will leave a scar on that place for years and years to come.
And Anna, because of that, understandable, sadness and the sorry business that's underway. We've heard the government saying now's not the time to get into some of the debates around what needs to change. But what are you picking up from those locals on the ground about whether there does need to be a point at which real change is discussed?
Yeah, my colleague from NITV, Emma Kellaway's just interviewed members of the little girl's family again over the weekend, and the message from the family and their supporters is they need time to grieve. Now is not the time to have some of the big discussions that lie ahead about how things might have unfolded, and that there is a real fear about, in this very sensitive early period, just in the days after, you know, this little girl's body was found, that if the conversation immediately turns to these bigger issues, that the community continues to be traumatised by feeling blamed for what happened. That is just a huge issue in such a small community. Alice Springs is tiny. The town camps are tiny as well, but along the track there will be more focus, understandably, on the broader issues. We expect probably a coronial inquest as well. So there will be chances for the broader circumstances to be looked at. The message from the Northern Territory Children's Commissioner, Sue-Ann Hunter, the National Indigenous Children's Commissioner, is that there also needs to be a look at the circumstances of custody in the Northern Territory when people leave prison. And there's also a wish from the community that the alcohol availability of takeaway alcohol is looked at as a key concern for them. So it is far more complex than just a question of disadvantaged town camps.
I mean, Paul, we saw there in the piece the calls from the opposition for an inquiry. Is their position basically what it was under Peter Dutton, that we need a royal commission into this? And how do you see the politics of this right now?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is just how utterly shocking it is. It's almost crude to talk about politics when something so tragic has occurred. And I think the opinion of just a middle Australian out there who doesn't receive much information about Indigenous Australia, a lot of Australians don't know many Indigenous people, which we saw during the Voice campaign. Most Australians would look at this and just think, how does such squalor exist in Australian society? How does such disadvantage still exist? And so even though now might not be the right time to have the big political debates because they could seem confronting, such national shame does require political drive, and you'll see Conservatives in coming days, I'm sure you're already seeing hints of this, suggest that the town camp should not exist. You saw this, this has long political history. There was the intervention from John Howard. Tony Abbott made a point that these towns shouldn't exist in modern Australian society. They'll be seen as confronting, probably won't have broad consensus in the Indigenous community. Progressives will push back against them. But is there a chance that Progressives and Conservatives can use this moment to think of a set of new practical solutions given the energy around this issue? Hopefully, but maybe not.
I think it's very fair to point out that a lot of Australians would look at these images, what we're seeing of conditions in the town camps, and just wonder how on earth is this happening. Of course, these problems have been there for a very long time. But Daniel, to that point, we can see some of the images there. Just give us a bit of a sense of how these town camps operate, why they exist.
Well, when Europeans settled Alice Springs, it was decided that Aboriginal people shouldn't be seen in the township, and so these camps were established. To see those pictures is to automatically think of the conditions and to think that are we living in a first world country here. But I think the other thing that's really important to remember is that these are people's homes. These are where people have a sense of themselves. One of the things that was told to me time and time again was to, knowing that I'm coming on this program, was to let people know that she was loved and she was taken care of, and she was surrounded by a community that supported her. So does
that go to the concern that the community feels like it'll be blamed?
Very, very anxious about the idea that, first of all, the only time you ever hear of Alice Springs is when something wrong or bad happens. Yeah. But also very anxious that people will be looked at, Aboriginal people will be pointed the finger at, instead of the systems that should be surrounding children of that age. Adequate water, adequate clothing, housing, education, love, all those things that should be
basics
surrounding any child of that age. Are those systems adequate enough to support those people?
And are they? What's the community saying? We can see those images, but Those basics that you're talking about, the housing, water, education, safety.
Well, I always think that to live below the poverty line in a place like Sydney or Melbourne is to live indeed in poverty. But in a place like the Northern Territory, to live below the poverty line, you are dealing with something else completely different altogether. The economics of the territory, the cost of food, the cost of petrol. I hate to think what the oil shock is going to bring to the community as the cost of diesel potentially rises. No, I spent some time up there last year, and I walked away from the place feeling extremely depressed, knowing that everyone there is trying their best, but also thinking that it's just who will be held accountable for these conditions? It seems to be something in Aboriginal affairs where, whether it's death in custody, whether it's poor educational attainment, no one is actually held accountable. And maybe not now because people are grieving and we need to respect that grief and not trample all over it. But maybe we do need an inquiry as to whether these systems are working, and we don't need it. We don't need it with looking into communities. We need it looking into the systems. We had an inquiry into that blamed Aboriginal people for their own predicament. It was called the intervention, and that made things worse. So we do need to look at the systems, but we do need to respect people's grief as well.
Ultimately, Anna, will this be a moment that you think leads to real change? Do you get that feeling, or is this going to be just another one of those terrible stories, but then it's business as usual?
There is such a feeling of desperation in the community that this is a moment for change, that this is a moment where the nation becomes aware of, such a shocking, shattering death, and that it, really makes governments sit up and come to the table around how those camps are operating, what can be done. And I just want to mention as well that there is a sense in the community as well of positivity around how the community came together. Extremely troubled relationship between the NT Police and the community in Central Australia. And Leanne Little from the NT Police, she's the leader of their Cultural Reform Command, said to me, the search, how they all work together, Indigenous community and police, was, in her view, hopefully a turning point for that relationship. They worked on the search, they grieved together. It was kind of
the definition of community policing. So the community working in conjunction with the police. It was the community that found the girl. It was the community that found the alleged perpetrator. And like I said, I've spoken to Leanne as well and to other people, and there is a tremendous sense of hope that mistrust that has been inherent in the relationship between Aboriginal people and the Northern Territory Police Force may have turned a corner.
All right, well, that's an important point. Yeah. Time now to talk to Nationals leader Matt Canavan. And to take us there, the growing calls for an inquiry after the death of Kumanjayi Little Baby.
We took to the last election a proposal for a Royal Commission, an independent inquiry into sexual abuse and violence in these communities, and we still think that is something that needs to be addressed.
Matt Canavan, welcome to the program. Can you just clarify for us, is the coalition once again calling for a Royal Commission, and into what exactly?
Well, as Angus just said there, this has been a long-standing position of the Liberal and National parties, both for a Royal Commission into some of the more shocking incidents we've seen, unfortunately, around our country to try and protect people, and also just a general inquiry as well into public funding in this space. Senator Jacinta Nambajimbi-Price moved this many times in the Senate in the last term. Every time it was rejected by the government. And look, I think it's very unfortunate, David, that since the defeat of the Voice, the government has effectively run scared from Indigenous policy. It seems to be doing nothing on this issue, and while this shocking instance, horrific instance, is not particularly to blame on any individual in the government, the lack of action here concerns me. I think we have to move on from the Voice. We've got to get back to taking practical steps to improve people's lives. I do think that under the former Tony Abbott government in particular, strides were being made. Tony made a real commitment. He used to live in community. He'd go and see the conditions. Nigel Scullion, the former Indigenous Affairs Minister, would go on the ground. I did the same as Northern Australian Minister. We were trying to find an economic base for these communities, because the simple facts are, David, that when money goes out the door, love flies out the window, and if these camps continue without a proper economic base, the circumstances that people live in, the issues they confront are going to be as tough as we've been confronted with over this past week.
But is it as simple as Tony Abbott did a wonderful job, Labor's doing a terrible job? Do you accept, we're looking at a bipartisan failure, really. When we look at these camps, you've got a Conservative government in power in the Territory. Both sides need to accept that the systems aren't working. It's not just, Labor's fault.
I didn't say Tony fixed everything, David. I thought we were making strides. And obviously this has been an area where all sides of politics have failed over many decades. I totally accept that. But we've got to try. We've got to give it a go. And as I say, since the defeat of the Voice, the government does not seem to be giving it a go. I think
it did put in a record amount of housing funding for remote communities, $4 billion over 10 years.
But this is the problem. But this is exactly the problem, David. It's exactly why my colleague Jacinta was calling for an inquiry into the funding. It's not a money issue. Right. I mean, governments of all political persuasions have spent tens of billions, it'd be hundreds of billions over many decades on these issues, and they continue to fail. That's not the problem. So pointing to a bunch of money is not good enough. You've got to get your hands dirty. You've got to get out there into communities. You've got to take practical action to help people's lives, not just throw money at it. And look, as I'm saying here, I am trying to be bipartisan here, David. So let's move on from the Voice defeat. It was a divisive debate. It failed. We've got to move on from it. It's time for the government to pick up pick itself up out of the dirt, but dust itself off and take action here. And I'm more than happy to work with the government on these issues. Maybe it should go and appoint Tony or look to Tony Abbott for some bipartisan leadership here. Because I say, he is somebody, a leader in this country, who's taken his issues very seriously, tried to take practical action. I used to work with Noel Pearson a lot. I'd love to reach out to Noel again. I mean, it was unfortunate and very divisive, this whole debate, but we've got to move on from it.
Let's turn to the Farrer by-election, less than a week to go. This seat, of course, has been a jewel in the crown for the coalition since it was formed back in 1949. It was Tim Fischer's seat, it was Susan Lee's seat. Are you worried the coalition's about to lose Farrer?
Those things don't concern me, David. I'm worried about our country. I'm very, very worried where the country is headed. That's why I'm fighting every day to try and make things better. And I'm fighting, yes, I do believe we can make things better if the Nationals Party is elected in Farrer. But I understand why people have been disillusioned with us. I've been down there for 20 days, 15 nights, and 10 of those I've been in a swag over the past month. I'm doing everything I can to fight for them. I'd love to fight for that great part of our country again. It's a wonderful, wonderful part of our nation where we pioneered the use of irrigation and dams. It still produces 40% of our food, 60% of our fruit. And for me, it's been a great platform for my leadership because what I want for our country is for us to rediscover our pioneering spirit. I want us to do big things like that again, which we seem to have lost the ambition for. So that's what I'm trying to achieve, David. It'll be up to the people of Farrer, obviously.
Are you saying you're not worried if you lose
Nationals
Farrer?
leader or not, a Nationals member or not? Well, look, as I say, no, I'm not really. David, I didn't really expect to be in this role. It was a little bit of a shock. I'm not going to die wondering. And it's not about, for me, my political party or my own career. I do this because I love Australia and I want to see it do better than we're doing right now.
But I would suspect
that's what
some of your
I'm
colleagues, not to mention your branch members, might be worried about losing a seat like Farrer. Losing seats in Parliament to One Nation isn't a worry?
I just don't. I mean, it seems it is such an alien concept. I know when I travel to Canberra that people seem to view everything through the prism of jobs for politicians. And your worries, as you put it, the worry is, well, do I keep a job? Do I keep my spot as leader?
It's whether you have seats in Parliament, surely, that matters in this business of politics,
but I mean, there are more important things in life, right? I've got 5 kids. I'm thankfully back home for a couple of nights. My son turned 17 this week. That's what I worry about.
Okay, but how can you implement change if you don't have seats in Parliament? I'm a little confused.
Yeah, of course, we've got to win. I'm in it to win it. And look, I'm fighting pretty hard to win it. But I just don't quite understand sometimes the emotional dialogue that is used in the press gallery in Canberra about these things, because what I worry about, the Australian people are worried right now. They're worried about the fact that they're paying $27,000 or more on their mortgage every year on average. $27,000 a year more. That's a worry. My job, my political party, is not a worry in comparison to the difficulties that Australian families are facing under the shocking economic policies of this government.
I want to ask you about that.
That's what I'm worried about, and that's what I'm fighting to change.
No, I understand that. I'm wanting to ask you about the decision to preference One Nation ahead of the independent Michelle Milthorpe. Your great mentor, the late National Senator Ron Boswell, as you would know, was a very strong opponent of doing any preference deals with One Nation. He argued, if we imply that One Nation's a plausible second-best alternative to the LNP, then we are strengthening its position and weakening ours. And if we do that, we're doing no favours to the battlers in the bush. Why do you take a different view?
Yeah, I love Ron, and I've got huge respect for him. I miss his counsel as he passed away earlier this year, sadly. Look, under my leadership, in my view, socialists and communists always go last. They got to, because they're the ones taking freedom away from the Australian people, weakening our economic opportunities. The Teal candidate, the so-called independent here in this electorate, is fundamentally running a dishonest campaign. She's running around saying that she'd like to see more oil refineries and the like. Well, on her website, it still says that she's against any new fossil fuel projects. So I'm not exactly sure how you could build a new refinery if you're also against fossil fuel projects. The facts are, David, that these Teals and their friends in the Greens are the principal reason why the living standards of Australians have crashed 15 years. Real wages in this country are back to levels not seen since 2011. And it's their policies of restricting the use of our energy resources, of seeking to close off entire industries in our economy, that has been the principal cause of making this country weaker.
Again,
and I'll fight that every day, and that's why they've got to go down the bottom. I recommend everybody putting it down the bottom.
Well, Michelle Milthorpe, of course, rejects the Teal label, but do you have any criticism of One Nation and David Farley at all, the One Nation candidate in this contest?
Absolutely, I do. I do that too. I absolutely do. I am recommending, of course, a vote for the Nationals Party. A second is the Liberal Party. Unfortunately, David Farley in the One Nation camp is also running a dishonest campaign. He failed to let the people of Farrer know that he tried to run for the Labor Party just 4 years ago. Under Anthony Albanese's team, he tried to get rid of the former Liberal National Party government. He tried to run for a party that was for net zero. He now says he wants to scrap net zero. He said the other day at a candidates debate that he was fine with Albo's migration policy settings, even though, again, his own party's website says they want them massively slashed.
Just on that, I think he's tried to clean
the people of...
Yeah, he's tried to clean the migration thing up, but you're right, to point to what he did say. What do you think on migration? In a seat like Farrer, does that part of Australia need more migrants or less?
We don't need more than we've got right now. We need much, much less. Now, as I said before, this part of our country was built by the pioneering spirit of Australians and new Australians, new migrants at the time that built the Snowy scheme. Spent a lot of great time with the Sikh community in Griffith, had a fantastic dinner with them the other night at the Kidman Wayside Inn. These are great people, great Australians that build our country.
And so what do you say to the farmers then in Farrer who might want more workers, more migrants to do some of that work, not to mention the small businesses in the seat?
Well, I get no pushback from people when I make very clearly that our policy will be to set Australia's migration settings, our numbers, in accordance with the needs of Australians, including, of course, relatively newly arrived Australians. They're Australians too, and they face the pressures of the mass migration we're seeing under this Labor government that has been contributing to that real wage drop that I mentioned, because too much migrants do put downward pressure on wages, hurts the very workers that the Labor Party purports to represent. And we do need to focus our migration program on productive economic needs, but particularly the blowout in student visa numbers are not contributing to our broader economy. And I think they're undermining the very purpose of our universities too. Our universities should be there to primarily teach Australians. But I speak to so many young Australians now who are aghast when they go into lecture theatres and the like, and there's maybe 15, 20% Australian-born students there. That's not right. and this government is not doing anything now to fix up that clear anomaly.
I want to ask you about the interim report of the Bondi Royal Commission released the other day. It said the Commonwealth and states and territories should prioritise efforts to finalise and implement an updated and nationally consistent national firearms agreement and national gun buyback scheme. Does this change your view on a gun buyback?
No, it doesn't. I've read the report, and I was underwhelmed by the report. I searched thoroughly after reading it. Well, why hasn't the report dealt with the major issue? And the major issue here was not the firearms held in the hands of these two monsters. It was the ideas in their heads that were the problem. And so the Royal Commission's report mentions Islam 11 times. Most of those times are simply quotes from terror threat levels. A couple of mentions of Islamophobia as well thrown in there. But the fact that it hasn't dealt with that fundamental problem, in my view, it totally misses the mark.
So do you agree with Pauline Hanson on this, that this is a disappointing interim report from the Royal Commissioner?
Well, I'll let Pauline have her own statements on it, but I just told you what I thought of it. I was deeply underwhelmed. It just didn't seem to tackle the major cause.
Just on the gun buyback, though, your colleague, the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Jonathan Duniam, says the government should do what they said they would, that they won't stand in the way. But do you want to stand in the way of a gun buyback?
Well, we didn't support the legislation. We don't support the legislation. It's up to the government now to do what it can, but up here in Queensland, I know my Liberal National Party colleagues are dead set against this.
And you're against it?
These just fundamentally take away, they take away rights from Australians for no benefit. I've spoken to so many people, particularly in Farrer, may I say, it would be nice if everybody tried to understand the position that farmers and lots of families who need firearms have been put in by these ridiculous caps of 5 firearms. I've spoken to many people in Farrer where they're making the choice between keeping the firearms they need for their farm, their livelihoods, and also trying to keep firearms that have been handed down from them from ancestors. Often firearms that were used in wars to defend this country.
Okay.
So we're forcing people to give up. Hang on, just let me finish this point, David. I'm just a bit emotional about this. We are forcing people, because Anthony Albanese just did this in a few days, right? Didn't even think about it. We are forcing Australians to give up the firearms that their fathers, their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers used to defend this country. So they've been handed down, these firearms. They're not really in use anymore, of course, but they are captured by these ridiculous knee-jerk laws which say they've got to give those up, give up their Australian heritage, give up the legacy that's been passed on to them to meet some ridiculous arbitrary number.
What about the checking
we have
of
thought
people
through
with
this
firearms?
A little bit more, but
the Royal Commissioner also says there appears to be no reason why ASIO should not be given access to the National Firearms Register. Do you have any problem with that?
Oh no, we haven't had any problems with that aspect of the changes. That's sensible.
So ASIO checking all gun owners. You have no problem with that.
Obviously, that's
on the budget, Matt Canavan, will you vote against any changes to property tax breaks?
Well, look, we haven't seen the details of this yet, David, but all we have seen from budget leaks is that the government wants to tax Australians more, and we're dead set against that. I mean, this week, tomorrow's Labor Day here in Queensland at least, and this week is actually also Tax Freedom Day. For the first week this week, Australians, you can, on average, you'll be working for yourself this week. Up to now, for the first third of the year, the first 4 months of the year, you've been working for the government. It's pretty sobering when you put it like that.
Back to the
4 months that you're giving up. So why are we increasing taxes?
Okay,
so
back to the question.
I'm not in favour of that.
If they do make changes in the budget to negative gearing, capital gains tax, you've previously said these should be totally opposed. Would you vote against them?
Well, as I say, I'm against tax increases. So we haven't seen the details yet.
You're leaving some room there.
Specific options. Look, I'll consider them. But what I want to see is tax rates go down. I think the problem at the moment we've got is the government has given up on growth. They've effectively given up on offering hope and opportunity for the Australian people.
All right, but
they're
just
left
on your
now in a version
on
of
the
the budget form of the Hunger Games, where they're looking to take from some people and give to the others. That's what they're doing.
Party, though,
that's fundamentally what they're doing.
Okay. Your candidate in Farrer, Brad Robertson, says he is open to considering changes to capital gains tax for people with multiple properties, not scrapping it altogether, but he's open to changing it for people with numerous properties. Are you on the same page?
Well, as I said, I'm waiting to see what the details are, but I don't support extra tax increases. Let's see what the government comes up with. But what I'd like
what about for people with multiple properties,
I'd like to see
if that's a tax increase for them?
Well, yeah, we've been the Labor Party themselves. The Prime Minister before the last election said he would not change negative gearing.
Sorry, your position. So if you've got multiple investment properties,
I'm not. This is what always you try and do. You try and get me to respond to something that the government hasn't even announced.
No, your candidate has said. No, I'm asking about what your candidate in Farrer, with the by-election 6 days away, said.
Yeah. Well, we are not for tax increases on the Australian people.
Okay.
I want to see growth. I want to see opportunity. I want to see a budget that's focused on increasing the incomes and living standards of all Australians.
You've been calling for oil drilling in the Taroom Trough in Queensland to help deal with the fuel crisis that we're all experiencing. The government says it's ready to look at a proposal but still hasn't really received any of the basic details on the number of wells that would be drilled, how deep they'd need to be, the impact on groundwater and so on. If this is so urgently needed, should the Queensland government get cracking on an assessment here?
Well, the Queensland government says it has provided that information. I know the federal government says they haven't. I suppose we're in a he said, she said environment. The problem, though, is that before Christmas last year, David, the government teamed up with the Greens to exclude fossil fuel projects from the national interest test. So even if the federal government, the Labor Party's views are right, and that the Queensland government needs to provide more information, they couldn't actually sign off on this project in the national interest because, amazingly, shockingly,
they can under the existing...
the Labor Party decided...
OK, to be clear though, they can, under the existing arrangement between the Commonwealth and the Queensland government, do an assessment at the Queensland level that can then be considered by the Commonwealth.
Yep.
Why aren't they doing that?
The thing though, David, is... But, David, the problem with that assessment is it has enormous timeframes under the EPBC Act. It requires consultation.
Groups,
as we've seen many times, can... Hang on, yeah, OK, but you're still looking at a minimum, David, you're looking at 2 or 3 years. The problem is... we have now got the ridiculous situation that the federal government cannot rule that a new oil project, a new diesel refinery is not in the national interest. They can't do that. Sorry, is in the national interest. They can't do that because they excluded fossil fuel projects from the national interest exemption.
As
we can see right now, is there much more that's more in the... Is there much more... Yeah, but the streamlined pathway is 2 years, David. Is there much more that would be in our national interest right now than getting a new oil field open, than getting a diesel refinery working? That would clearly be in our national interest, yet the government doesn't think so because it teamed up with the Greens. So they can approve a massive new solar project with the stroke of their pen, but no one in the world is running around, the government's not running around the world begging for solar panels. They're running around the world begging our close neighbours for oil. So why would the government be doing so desperately do that, but not willing to fast track here and provide a national interest exemption for an oil project in Australia? Now, we've offered to change that back. We actually moved an amendment last sitting week, so let's get rid of that. Let's exclude the Greens here and get back onto the land of common sense where the national interest does include the drilling for oil in this country. The government rejected that. That offer remains on the table. We're happy to be constructive, but let's get cracking here, guys. Let's focus on Australia again and our own fuel security.
Nationals leader Matt Canavan, will have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this morning. Well, coming up, flying high or beholden to a billionaire? Just what should voters make of Pauline Hanson's brand new plane? From Gina Reinhart. First, let's get back to our panel. We're joined once more by Paul Sakkal from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Anna Henderson from SBS and the 7am podcast's Daniel James. Now, before we get to what we just heard from Matt Canavan there, some breaking news we've just received. 47-year-old Jefferson Lewis has been charged. That's, of course, Anna, in relation to what we were discussing earlier from Alice Springs, but that charge has now come through, just to bring people the breaking news on that.
Yeah.
That won't be a great surprise, I'm sure, but that development is important and will change, I'm sure, how people are viewing the way this is all being dealt with by the system, by the court system as well.
Just on, can I just pick up something the Senator just said on the first part of our conversation? I think he makes a plausible argument that this government has shied away from Indigenous affairs post the Voice to Parliament referendum. And if the lesson for the government from that referendum was that many Australians are uncomfortable with progressive framing on symbolism, that might be the right one. It wouldn't be the right lesson that Australians are not interested in the practical conditions on the ground. So if this is a moment where, as Matt Canavan says, maybe we move on from the Voice finally, the two parties can start talking about these issues again, then that would be a positive thing.
Let's turn to the Farrer by-election. And Matt Canavan not too worried about losing this seat.
So he says,
by the sounds
yes.
of it.
I mean, you've got to put on a brave face at this point, don't you? You're a week out from polling day and it is looking like the One Nation candidate is in a good position. But the community independent, Michelle Millthorpe, is also, you know, gaining traction in the more urban area around Albury. So there is still a ways to go with this.
She's going to need a pretty high primary vote, though, without the
will.
preferences that One Nation will be getting from the coalition parties.
She will. I mean, there is this theory as well that, you know, maybe the coalition thinks that, and I have had this discussed with me, maybe it's better if One Nation does end up winning this one because they'll be easier to unseat. They'll probably fall apart. They might turn.
Independents are pretty hard to get rid of once they're in.
Yes, but if an independent came in as a One Nation candidate, the theory inside the coalition is maybe it'll be easier to address this down the track. We haven't made the inroads this time. Who knows? But I think there is anger in that seat. There is frustration with the major parties, and One Nation has picked up on that.
Well, this is the thing, Daniel. I mean, and Matt Canavan was going through it there. David Farley, the One Nation candidate's had some troubles over the last week, particularly thanks to Paul's newspaper revealing various things about, you know, he tried to run for Labor and said lovely things about Michelle Millthorpe at last year's election and so on.
Disgraceful.
Yeah. Will One Nation voters, or those who are really having a good look at One Nation, will they care about any of this stuff?
No, I don't think so. I think people aren't as invested in these things as perhaps we are. I think that the One Nation brand now is so strong, and people are just looking to sort of like burn the traditional way of politics down. Whether that is based on any sort of policy settings that One Nation has is probably unclear. But Farrow's going to be very, very interesting because it's a huge electorate. The eastern side is pretty urbane. The
big centre of Albury.
Yep. And then the western side is where the Denny Ute muster is. And I have a sister that lives near Deniliquin.
Right.
And the feeling and the sentiment is on the ground that One Nation is really in with
is surging in that part of the sea.
Surging in that part of the place.
Interesting. Yeah. No, it's going to be fascinating. Paul, what's your mail heading into the last week of this contest, and how did those revelations around David Farley go down with the One Nation leadership?
Well, as you say, great work from my colleague Rob Harris. And just for people who haven't seen these stories, it turns out David Farley, the One Nation candidate, who's pitched himself as a solidly right-wing bloke, previously supported the Labor Party, and before the last election, previously supported what the Nationals senator called the Teal candidate. So appears to be a party shopper. And inside One Nation, this candidate has turned into a real disaster. Right. There's a lot of anger towards him. It was put to me by someone involved in the by-election that now that Pauline has the $2 million plane from Gina, it would be best for One Nation's chances if he got on that plane and maybe went to Port Augusta for the last week of the campaign.
Not the first time they've had problems with a candidate and their selection, I suppose, but this is a big moment for the party.
And it's a new type of candidate stuff up. Usually they've got someone with a checkered criminal history. This is a really successful businessman who ticks a lot of boxes, but One Nation had no idea that he'd previously supported other parties.
What do they think, though? Are they still going to win this? Is that the expectation?
Their polling hasn't seemed to have changed in any of the parties' reads on where this race is at. It seems a really tight contest between One Nation and the Climate 200-backed Independent, who, by the way, does have significant links to the Teal movement in terms of who's campaigning for her, where her research is coming from. So I think it is misleading for her to say there's no link to the Teal movement. It's going to be really tight. The Liberals are next to no hope, and the Nationals will poll at a very lowly level, though perhaps higher than they would have polled under David Littleproud.
And just briefly, beyond the kind of party shopping, there's also the fact that this is an electorate that has a really big migrant community. Like there are parts of some of these towns that have street names or other names in the community which are in different languages, in Punjabi or other languages. So some of the migration rhetoric nationally has had some trouble getting traction, and even David Farley himself has said in a community forum that in a broad sense he doesn't think the migration levels were too high, and had to then retract in his Facebook statement to say the opposite. So he's had a bit of trouble holding the line.
There was a by-election, a state-level by-election in the Victorian seat of Nepean last night. I just want to show you the results of that. It was an interesting contest between Liberal, One Nation and the Independent. No Labor candidate here. The Liberals held on, and I think they'll be pretty happy about that. They took a haircut, their primary vote down nearly 10%, but enough to win on preferences, and the One Nation vote, roughly where the polls have had them, and the Independent at 21%. But in the context of a Victorian state election coming up, in November, Jess Wilson, the Liberal state leader there, will be pretty happy to get a bit of momentum out of that.
Yeah, there were senior Liberals in Victoria yesterday really worried they would lose this seat, which would have been a totally extraordinary result. This is a coastal seat, not a mortgage belt area. There are pockets of disadvantage, but largely it's older, whiter, more affluent.
And they're going to One Nation?
They went to One Nation significantly, but largely they stuck Liberal. I mean, the primary vote has fallen there by about 10 points, but it's still pretty solid. But there are indicators there in the more working class areas which are more reflective of the rest of Victoria that there are huge swings to One Nation, but still not the momentum boost that One Nation was hoping for. And really troublingly for Liberals, on the booths, they're hearing messages from One Nation supporters saying, you know, we want Labor to not win the next election, but we're still going to go with One Nation because, you know, you guys are all fighting Labor, right? And Liberals are not getting this argument into voters' minds yet that a vote for One Nation does not help the opposition keep Labor out. So that might take more time.
Just quickly on the Bondi interim Royal Commission report, Matt Canavan expressing some underwhelm with where it's landed. Just a couple of parts to this. One on the gun buybacks, he's not shifting, opposed flat out to any new gun buyback. And of course this, you know, as we just marked the anniversary of Port Arthur and the gun buyback that the Howard government put in place. But is there a little bit of difference between the Liberals and the Nationals on this, do you think, Anna, on the gun buyback and whether to fight against it or just let it now happen?
The Nationals are making it a very emotive issue. They're making it something which is about like life on the land and what you should be able to expect is your right. Sounds a bit like what happens in other countries.
Granddad's guns that you've inherited.
Absolutely historical. But I think the reality is that this is a voluntary system unless you have quite a lot of guns, and that the Royal Commissioner put out this interim report, and we weren't necessarily clear on whether it would have anything really specific in it because it was so early on. They were dealing with agencies, and she has specifically put this gun buyback issue in that report.
Which is still stuck with most of the states, isn't it? New South Wales is absolutely on board, but Queensland's flat out opposed, and some of the other states
opposed. South Australia's iffy. Tasmania's looking like they're firming up against it. It's really important to remember on like the 30th anniversary of Port Arthur that we have 25% more guns in Australia now than we did then. And when we've got crime problems in some of our major cities where people are running around with machetes and hacking each other to death in some cases, do we want those people having access to guns? Do we want the country awash with guns? Because if that were to happen, then we're heading into American territory.
The other part of this interim report from the Royal Commissioner, overall funding to the national intelligence agencies has gone up, but the proportion that's gone to counter-terrorism significantly decreased between 2020 and 2025 after the collapse of ISIS and the rise of concerns around foreign espionage and so on. But after October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel, the rise of anti-Semitic attacks, Mike Burgess, the ASIO boss, lifted the terror alert level. Why wasn't more money put back into counter-terrorism, or is the government rejecting what the Royal Commissioner's found here?
I think there were competing
you spoke to the
priorities.
PM about this, didn't you?
Yes, and look, I think he rejects the idea that they reduced funding to counter-terrorism outright. But there's a question of proportionality, in the size of the budget, how much overtime was being allocated to counter-terrorism. And so it is possible for two things to be true. We increased the budget, but less of the increased budget was going to counter-terrorism.
There's also a concern that Virginia Bell has included the total budget of Home Affairs in this list, and that includes everything from immigration to, it's much, much broader than just national intelligence.
And some of the figures are classified, so it's hard to make a separate decision about what is the case here, but the reality is that the Commissioner put specifically in the report that counter-terrorism funding as a proportion significantly declined between 2020 and 2025, and that's unavoidable for the government to have to deal with.
And the numbers, it's such a technical debate, but to take a step back, this really does go to the heart of the political debate at the start of whether we should have a Royal Commission. Anthony Albanese appointed Dennis Richardson, the former ASIO boss, to do his own inquiry. He was then folded into the Royal Commission to really give it the national security heft that people were seeking. Dennis Richardson's private view, which he fed into the start of this Royal Commission, was that ASIO's eye and the government's eye was taken off the ball in terms of Islamic extremism post the fall of the caliphate, and not enough was done post-October 7, and then also not enough additional resources were brought into counter-terrorism post the terror threat level going up in 2024. Now, his views are not shared by the agencies. There's been a clash of opinion. Some of what he's found has emerged into this interim report, and the Prime Minister was very keen to emphasise one element of the Royal Commission's interim report, which was that the government did not hinder any agency's ability to stop these two individuals. But it's a very narrow finding. He actually denied a question from you, Anna, where you just read out the finding about the significant decline in counter-terrorism. He said that wasn't right, and he was mistaken. So there's more in this.
Yeah. On the budget, we're 9 days out. The Treasurer, the PM, been dropping more breadcrumbs as we get closer. It seems pretty clear there are changes coming on negative gearing, capital gains tax, and trusts as well. The Treasurer has been talking about transitional arrangements, I think suggesting that there will be perhaps not full grandfathering of existing investments, but my understanding is, and I think he might have hinted at this, a transitional arrangement that could see your existing investment dealt with under the existing rules, but once the change happens, it's dealt with under the new rules. Nonetheless, Paul, none of this was mentioned at the election.
No.
Is that going to be an issue for them?
Yeah, well, as you say, they're trying to soften the blow. There'll be grandfathering, but at a time when people are feeling pretty frazzled about the economy and about the world, and there's a general pessimism in the society, even an attempt at making some of these changes is a big step for this government, which has been accused of being cautious in the past. We'll see what the details are, but this is a big, my understanding is that it will be effectively campaigned on after the budget.
Well, I think, and I think there's also the counter-argument within, or view within the government too, that if they don't touch this stuff, they're going to be punished for lacking ambition, missing a moment. People want big change. This intergenerational equity thing is real. I guess there are risks if they don't do it as well.
Yeah, it's an attempt to sort of control the narrative around inequity. I mean, it came during a week in which Anglicare released a report that showed that people on JobSeeker, out of all the rental properties in Australia, all 48,000 of them, only one would have been affordable for someone on JobSeeker. So the government needs to be seen to be doing something about the cost of living, but also be seen to be doing something about inequity.
Yeah, and we saw the pressures that are there for everybody with the inflation numbers this week. I mean, a little better than was expected, and I think some of the expectations of another rate hike on Tuesday have come off a little bit, but there's still overwhelmingly an expectation there will be another rate hike.
Absolutely, and even though the underlying number was steady, I mean, I think we are seeing, even though our government is trying to really constrain a level of concern in the community around what's happening with fuel and what could happen over the next few months in terms of cost and availability, internationally we're seeing the commentary pretty black and white. I mean, the government is chasing barrels across the world to keep that flow going, but if we do see a real tightening on those issues down the track, what that could do to the economy, to inflation, to employment is really serious. So I think they're trying to manage that, and I think we're in really uncharted territory as the year goes on about where this might go.
One thing it has also cleared up during the week, the Prime Minister said there'll be no change to the tax on gas, or at least existing contracted gas. Leaves a little bit of room for doing something down the track. But for this budget, there won't be a change. That pressure campaign will continue, though, including at the Labor conference coming up in July. And Ed Husick, at least one backbencher, is going to keep that pressure on as well. He's still fighting this on social media.
Not going to go away at all. The Prime Minister has been keen to point out the misleading elements of this political campaign, which has just gone crazy online. I mean, I'm having friends who do not follow politics say, oh, this David Pocock guy,
why aren't we taxing gas?
Why aren't we taxing gas? But I think they have let themselves down, the campaigners, by using some misleading stats and not being fair in some aspects of how they've gone about it, because that's allowed the government to cast them as radical and misleading. But I think the government can only take on so many fights at one time. I suspect they'll still think about changes later in the term. And they are trying to pitch their intergenerational equity changes as a guard against populism on the right. But the other element to that is they're watching what's happening in the UK with the Greens and in other places with left-wing economic populism.
Yeah, they could be squeezed on both ends.
They know they need to counter that too. So there's
and there'll be, sorry, Spearsy, but just to also mention, like, the campaign continues, and I believe there'll be a mobile billboard at the Rabbitohs game next weekend for those who are promoting this gas tax. So they're really targeting events that the Prime Minister might have his eye on.
The Japanese Prime Minister who's visiting, I think, arrives later today. There's going to be some ads that the Australia Institute's putting out tomorrow welcoming the Japanese Prime Minister, congratulating her on the tax that Japan collects on gas compared to Australia. Anyway.
We'll have to do a fact check on the billboards.
Probably. We were talking earlier about how One Nation's been soaring high in the polls. Well, Pauline Hanson now has a sexy new small plane thanks to a big donation from her billionaire backer.
Pauline Hanson is flying high above her supporters in a brand new private plane.
This aircraft is not for joyrides. This aircraft is for the battle for Australians.
Yes, it's fast. Yes, it's amazing. Yes, it's sexy, she boasted on social media.
With the billionaire's backing.
From Gina Reinhart and Associates.
Her heart is with the Australian people.
Oh, look, that's a matter for Gina Reinhart and a matter for One Nation.
I think Pauline Hanson's a wholly owned subsidiary of Gina Reinhart.
No one buys my vote.
Would you accept a plane from Gina Reinhart if she offered you one?
I haven't had an offer. So
maybe
I'm not going to be drawn on that.
Oh, there you go. Look, once again, will One Nation voters care, or does this closeness to Gina Reinhart start to matter?
Well, in normal circumstances, David, you know, I got my abacus out last night and I worked out that the average billionaire in Australia earns around $63,000 to $87,000 an hour.
An hour?
An hour, right. Which is, you know, roughly half of what you're on,
exactly,
David.
Exactly.
But I don't think they will care. I think in normal circumstances, flying 30,000 feet above people who are struggling on the mortgage belt in a plane brought to you by a billionaire and you know, other rich people donating millions of dollars would play out. I mean, if it was Angus or if it was Albo, wouldn't wash so well.
They get smashed.
But we are living in a different world.
And this is the thing: the normal rules don't apply.
The timing. This very highly produced video and this announcement came out the day of the inflation number. So when Australians were looking at that number and thinking about, are we going to be hit with another mortgage increase? When will that happen? How will we afford it? Pauline Hanson is literally kissing a multi-million-dollar private plane, but at the same time, I looked at the comments and her supporters were saying, now you're not going to cost the taxpayers the money of travels. So
well, that's the flip side here.
Yeah.
Well, it's not charging the taxpayer, it's just a billionaire, and Pauline will be able to get around a lot more coalition seats now.
Yeah, I actually disagree with you guys to some extent. I think the vociferous, you know, showboating that she's shown here is a bit of a bluff. I think people in One Nation know that over time this will become a perception problem. At the moment it doesn't because her approval rating is just so high and she's running on a vibe. I think eventually this will start to be talked about, and if Pauline Hanson wants to guard against the idea that she is a wholly owned subsidiary of Gina Reinhart, as Jim Chalmers says, then the billboards around Farrer this week supporting Ben Roberts-Smith, totally disregarding the rule of law in that case, is not a good starting point.
All right, our panel, Daniel James, Anna Henderson, Paul Sakkal, back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for the New Daily. I'm talking pictures this morning with comedian and co-host of the Serious Danger podcast, Tom Ballard, and a very warm welcome.
Hello,
and
Mike.
You're in the middle of a comedy tour.
Big old tour, yes. I'm finishing up my show Be Funny Challenge Impossible, which is at the Brisbane Comedy Festival next week.
Tom, they say that economics is the dismal science, and I bet Jim Chalmers would agree this week, because inflation, deflation, Warren Brown's cartoon has got a deflating treasurer.
He looks pretty lost of air now at this point, hasn't he?
Harry Bruce from the Townsville Bulletin has beautifully depicted Donald Trump giving the cannonball that's engulfing the world.
Cannonball! I like how Elbow is swimming between the flags. I don't know if that'll help.
He seems to have lost his budgie smugglers there, I think. Tom, the profits on gas exports might be very high, but the will to actually tax them properly seems to be very low.
Well, amongst the political class, yes.
Beautiful Matt Golding cartoon. He's got the Prime Minister here ripping up the tax on gas exports, but at least it's being recycled.
Well, no, he's throwing out the tax on gas exports, recycling the industry talking points.
Beautiful Fiona Kataskis. Ever get the feeling someone's gaslight?
Beautiful. I love the little detail of Elbow poking around the gas bottle there.
Yeah.
He's hiding behind the gas industry, but also supporting them and encouraging encouraging their gaslighting, and as they assure us that they're totally paying their fair share of taxes.
One Nation seems to be flying pretty high, and Dean Alston from the West Australian has picked up on the plane.
They've gone with please exploin. And Pauline said, yes, I've got a plane and it's sexy. And I think looking at this depiction here, this is sexy stuff.
Jess Harwood, thanks for the plane and all your help on the campaign, Gina.
Just remember who's steering it, Pauline.
Yeah.
Well, it's a classic working class story. You know, it's really inspiring. This woman, single mum, running a fish and chip shop, and then gets donated a plane by Australia's richest person.
Donald Trump wants to live like a king, and this week he got a visit from an actual king.
This is such beautiful drawings of some of the most attractive people in the world, and I'm finding it hard to concentrate. Mind your step, Your Highness.
As he's coming down the Epstein stairs. Lovely David Rose.
It's a little bit like Fawlty Towers, that it just don't mention the list. Don't mention the list. I mean, look at everything that's going on here on Trump with like all the little slogans, show me the ballroom, Falklands, NATO.
John Spooner has got some suggestions for the design of the new ballroom at the White House.
I think it's the Trump Tower of London. That's what we've got here. This is great.
Two kings here. Mark Knight's picked up our two countries.
Please, Mike, allow me. Our two countries, the similarities outweigh the differences.
Yeah, it's quite disturbing, isn't it? The White House actually, you can't say tweeted, you've got to say X'd. Two kings.
What is happening, Mike?
I don't know.
There were literally massive protests. The No Kings protest.
I know.
Trump said, I'm not a king.
Yeah.
If I was a king, I'd get more done, which also doesn't make any sense. And now the White House is tweeting out an image of bloody Statler and Waldorf and calling them two kings.
We're in a weird place.
There needs to be some semblance of reality to do satire within, and now we're just here.
Lovely Matt Golding. There's something lost in translation here, even though they have the same language. I'm here to address the special relationship.
I had nothing to do with that sexual predator.
Oh, brother.
Him either. That is, I have no notes on this. This is a perfect cartoon.
Tom, it's been a great pleasure having you back on Talking Pictures, and I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks, Mike. Back to you, David. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Daniel.
Travis Lovett, the former Europe Commissioner, is into day 15, 372 kilometres into his walk from Melbourne to Canberra for the Walk for Truth. And what he's calling for is a national truth-telling commission, and he's hoping to meet the Prime Minister when he arrives here at the start of Reconciliation Week on May 27th. Truth Commission won't solve everything by itself, but if we talk about the story of this place, then perhaps we'll understand better why things are happening in Alice Springs.
Yeah, good point. Anna.
So we do have a busy international schedule at the moment with visitors to Canberra. You mentioned the Japanese Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, is arriving tonight. She has formal events tomorrow, comes after the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and also Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President. But in this case, unlike those, there's no confirmation yet of whether the two leaders will take questions when they appear together tomorrow. Something you would probably expect in this case. There'd be a chance for questions from either side. And I
Both
don't
great
know,
democracies, lovers of the free press.
This would be a usual expectation. It's unclear whether or not some pesky questions around gas exports might be a reason to not take press
China.
engagement.
Yeah, exactly. Paul.
Liberals are happy that Angus Taylor is talking about migration. They thought it was an issue that needed to be addressed, and they think he's made an okay start as leader on the whole. But there's some worry about some of the language he's used on the migration question. Sitting just in this studio last week, he started talking about the higher risk of migrants from bad countries, not bad governments or autocratic regimes, but the countries themselves. And that's caused concern, particularly in the Iranian community, which is very close to the Liberal Party because of its foreign policy stance. There's been a bit of blowback that MPs have needed to deal with. Also some concern that that policy didn't go through shadow cabinet, only went through leadership group. Same for a recent policy on energy. So just a little bubbling of concern, nothing too serious yet, but one to watch out for.
All right, very interesting. Thank you all very much for this morning. Finally, Donald Trump has been taking plenty of potshots at allies lately, but it was a very different tone with the King, as we saw. Indeed, there was one moment that forced even Charles to blush. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
I also remember her saying very clearly, Charles, look, young Charles, he's so cute. It's my mother. My mother had a crush on Charles. Can you believe it?
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.